Night fell over Baltimore before Edgar Allan Poe disappeared into it. By the time he was found again, something already seemed wrong. He was delirious, disoriented, wearing clothes that did not belong to him. Witnesses claimed he drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking incoherently, sometimes calling out names no one could fully understand. One newspaper later described him as being in great distress. Another claimed he appeared exhausted beyond recognition, as though he had been wandering through something far heavier than the city itself. And then, only a few days later, he died. No clear explanation was ever confirmed. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, historians still debate what happened during those final missing days of Edgar Allan Poe's life. Alcohol, illness, violence, rabies, political kidnapping schemes known as cooping. Some theories sound plausible, while others sound outright outlandish. But perhaps that uncertainty feels strangely appropriate. Because Edgar Allan Poe walked the narrow boundary where the ordinary dissolves. Where reality distorts, logic gives way to fear, as the hidden machinery of the world reveals itself in fleeting and unsettling glimpses. And in the end, even his own death became a mystery that refused to fully explain itself. But the deeper mystery was never simply how Poe died. It was how a man who spent most of his life drowning in instability somehow reshaped modern literature forever. Because Poe did not merely write horror stories. He helped humanity put language to psychological darkness long before psychology itself fully understood what it was looking at. To understand Edgar Allan Poe, you have to understand the world that created him. He was born in 1809 into a country that still felt unfinished. America was young, unstable, restless. Cities expanded quickly. Disease spread easily. Poverty lingered everywhere beneath the optimism of progress. Death was not an abstract fear in the 19th century. It was visible constantly, in homes, in streets, in families. And Poe encountered it early. His father disappeared not long after his birth. His mother, an actress named Eliza Poe, died from tuberculosis when Edgar was still a small child. He watched her fade slowly as illness consumed her body, something that would later echo throughout nearly everything he wrote. Women in Edgar Allan Poe's tales seem fated to vanish young, not in metaphor, not by mischance, but with an eerie obsession, as though compelled by some unseen force. Years later, Poe himself would write that the death of a beautiful woman was the most poetical topic in the world. To modern readers, the line can sound disturbing, but beneath it sits something more personal and tragic. Poe kept losing the people he loved before he was emotionally prepared to lose them. After his mother's death, Poe was taken in by John Allan, a wealthy tobacco merchant in Richmond, Virginia. The relationship gave Poe opportunity, education, and social standing, but it never fully gave him stability. John Allan was practical, disciplined, business-minded. Poe was imaginative, emotionally volatile, and increasingly consumed by literature. The two clashed constantly. Even as a young man, Poe seemed caught between incompatible worlds. Part of him wanted recognition and structure. Another part resisted authority almost instinctively. At the University of Virginia, those tensions worsened. Poe excelled academically, particularly in languages. But gambling debts quickly piled up. Allan refused to fully support him financially, and resentment grew between them until the relationship fractured almost beyond repair. By the age where many people are still discovering who they are, Poe already seemed to be unraveling into contradictions. Brilliant, though unstable. Charming yet profoundly alone. Disciplined in craft, destructive in life. And beneath all of it sat a growing obsession with the hidden architecture of the human mind. Long before modern detective fiction existed, Poe became fascinated by logic itself. Patterns, codes, the invisible structures hidden beneath chaos. Most people associate Poe only with ravens, haunted mansions, and psychological collapse. But, remarkably, he also helped invent the modern detective story. In 1841, Poe published The Murders in the Rue Morgue, introducing a character named C. Auguste Dupin. Dupin solved crimes not through violence or intuition, but through analytical reasoning and psychological observation. Decades later, Arthur Conan Doyle would openly acknowledge that Sherlock Holmes owed a debt to Poe's work. Without Poe, modern detective fiction may have developed very differently. But even that only reveals part of his mind. Poe was deeply fascinated by cryptography. He challenged newspaper readers to send him encoded messages, proudly claiming he could solve any cipher presented to him. And astonishingly, he solved nearly all of them. To Poe, hidden meaning was irresistible, not just in puzzles, in people, in society, in consciousness itself. That obsession appears everywhere in his stories. Characters descend into paranoia while insisting they remain rational. Narrators confess crimes while trying to prove their innocence. Rooms seem alive with psychological pressure. Time stretches unnaturally as reality bends under emotional weight. Poe understood something many writers before him had not fully explored yet. The mind itself could become the setting of the horror. And perhaps that is why his stories still feel strangely modern, because even today, some of the greatest fears people experience are invisible to everyone else. Anxiety, isolation, obsession, the feeling that your own thoughts are slowly turning against you. Poe wrote about those states decades before psychology had the language to categorize them clinically. And yet, despite the originality of his work, Poe spent much of his actual life struggling financially. The Raven transformed him into a literary sensation almost overnight in 1845. Audiences were captivated by its rhythm, melancholy, and eerie atmosphere. The image of the black bird perched above the chamber door became permanently embedded into literary history. But fame did not bring Poe the stability many assume followed. In fact, he was paid surprisingly little for the poem that made him immortal. This was the brutal reality of literary culture in 19th-century America. Writers often survived through unstable magazine work, harsh editorial environments, and inconsistent payments. Poe spent years working as a critic and editor, reviewing the works of other writers with a level of sharpness that earned him both admiration and enemies. While some admired his honesty, others considered him vicious. Poe developed a reputation for publicly dismantling weak writing with almost surgical precision. And over time, that reputation followed him everywhere. But while Poe's public image grew darker, another tragedy slowly unfolded in private. His wife, Virginia Poe, became severely ill with tuberculosis. Once again, illness entered his life like a shadow he could never outrun. Friends recalled moments where Poe appeared utterly devastated by her condition. Some described him pacing anxiously through rooms, while Virginia struggled to breathe nearby. Others remembered periods where he seemed emotionally exhausted beyond words, and as her health declined, the emotional atmosphere surrounding his writing became even heavier. You can almost feel it in works like The Raven, all of the grief, the everlasting longing, the inability to let memory remain buried. When Virginia finally died in 1847, Poe changed visibly. The instability that had always existed within him seemed to deepen. He continued writing, continued lecturing, continued trying to maintain some form of literary career. But people around him increasingly described periods of emotional collapse, erratic behavior, and profound exhaustion. And yet, even here, reducing Poe to a caricature of madness misses something important. Because beneath the mythology surrounding him was an intensely intelligent and unusually perceptive mind. Poe was not simply interested in frightening readers. He was interested in exposing fragility, the fragility of identity, of certainty and perception. He understood how easily human beings convince themselves they are rational, while secretly being ruled by emotion, fear, ego, guilt, and obsession. And perhaps what makes his work endure is that he never fully separated horror from truth. In Poe's stories, terror rarely arrives as a monster crashing through the door. It arrives quietly, first as guilt, then as memory. Isolation follows, until at last you sense the mind itself beginning to slip from your grasp. Even his influence expanded beyond genres people normally associate with him. Poe's work helped shape early science fiction. Writers like Jules Verne admired him deeply. His story, The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, explored space travel decades before humanity had any realistic ability to approach it. Other works experimented with cosmology, mathematics, and speculative ideas about the universe itself. He was not confined to Gothic darkness. He was equally drawn to possibility, to hidden systems, to realities that moved beneath the surface of the visible world. Which makes it strangely fitting that, after his death, Poe himself became surrounded by myth. For years, a mysterious visitor known only as the Poe Toaster appeared annually at Poe's grave in Baltimore, leaving behind roses and partially filled bottles of cognac under the cover of night. The ritual continued for decades before suddenly stopping in the early 21st century. No one ever fully confirmed the visitor's identity. Even long after death, Poe continued generating mysteries. And perhaps that is because Edgar Allan Poe represents something larger than literature alone. He represents the uncomfortable realization that intelligence and suffering often coexist more closely than people wish to admit. How creativity can illuminate parts of the human experience most people spend their lives trying not to examine. Why beauty and decay are not opposites as often as we pretend. And that beneath civilization's polished surface, the human mind still contains rooms capable of becoming labyrinths. Today, Poe's influence exists almost everywhere, even for those who have never read him directly. In modern detective fiction and psychological horror, in dark atmospheric storytelling where the storyteller's mind becomes part of the mystery. and in the understanding that fear often emerges from within. All of it carries traces of Poe. But perhaps the strangest thing about Edgar Allan Poe is this. The man who spent much of his life feeling misunderstood eventually became one of the most recognizable literary figures in human history. Not because he gave people comfort, but because he understood something many others avoided, that human beings are often frightened not by darkness itself, but by what they discover within it. And perhaps that's why Poe endures, long after he left the world behind, because the raven was never the real terror. The real terror was the mind capable of summoning it.